14 billion years ago, the universe began. A few minor events have happened along the way, but the most important thing is you are here, lifting weights. You're consciously just aware of lifting the weight, but your body is doing something remarkable. Countless electrical signals are rapidly sent to your muscle tissue, enabling the recruitment of hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers, in which a cascade of events including calcium release, ATP breakdown, the power stroke, and thus force generation occur. Energy systems are getting depleted, metabolites and fluid have accumulated. But then you stop and rest before performing another set. Time may be an illusion, but we're stuck with it. So how long should you rest until your next set? I'm glad to say we finally have our first ever meta-analysis on the impact of different rest time between sets on muscle hypertrophy. For those who don't know, meta-analyses combine the results of numerous studies on the same topic and are generally considered some of the best evidence. This doesn't mean they are always flawless, but they can be highly insightful. For us to fully comprehend the scope of the first rest interval meta-analysis in human history, such that by the end you'll have a clearer understanding of how long you may choose to rest between sets, we need to go back to the 1990s. On the 1st of October 1990, a month before Home Alone was released and a time period in which supermarkets look like this research paper was published. Lifting weights can temporarily increase anabolic hormone levels, and the paper found in a group of men, training with shorter rest between sets resulted in greater temporary increases in growth hormone. Other studies similarly find this, and since these hormones are related to muscle growth, surely this is proof short rest between sets maximize muscle hypertrophy. Well, multiple researchers thought it could be. The training practices of actual bodybuilders probably intensified this, since as detailed in this classic 1987 paper, the majority of bodybuilders recruited rested 10 to 90 seconds between sets. Imagine that, just 10 seconds between sets. The legendary Arnold, in his book, recommended a minute or less of rest between sets. But moving forwards to 2009 to 2011, some studies mark the beginning of a paradigm shift. Instead of merely observing the hormonal responses to different rest time between sets, researchers actually decided to measure muscle growth. A 2009 paper found in a group of previously untrained men training this program, resting 2.5 minutes between sets tended to produce greater arm and thigh growth than 1 minute of rest between sets. This was despite the fact that temporary increases in testosterone and growth hormone, at least in the initial weeks, were larger with a 1 minute condition. A 2010 paper had a slightly unconventional approach. They had trained subjects perform this program. One group rested 2 minutes between sets, but another group, over the weeks, gradually decreased their rest time between sets down to 30 seconds. If short rests were definitely better for growth, we'd guess this group would grow more, but arm and thigh growth was similar between both. The 2011 paper had virtually an identical design and found the same thing, so one of the papers found longer rests were better, while two find similar gains between decreasing rest time and resting for 2 minutes. We'll mention these two papers again a little later, but as remarked in this 2014 review, no study had demonstrated greater hypertrophy with shorter rests, except a study published in the very same year. It found in older men, resting for 1 minute between sets led to greater hypertrophy than resting for 4 minutes between sets. Now before you go and crash your head against the wall in confusion and curse science, the devil is in the details. Both groups perform the same number of reps with the same load. This is a problem, because doing this with shorter rests between sets means you get closer to failure than if you use longer rests, which is potentially a sound explanation as to why they saw better gains. The fact is, regardless of the rest time between sets we use, we want to train to or close to failure, and this is what the other papers did. You know what else did this? Probably the most popular research paper ever on rest time between sets, published in 2016. Trained subjects performed these exercises with these variables. After training 3 times per week for 8 weeks, muscle growth was overall better when resting for 3 minutes between sets compared to 1 minute. Fast forwarding yet another year forward, a 2017 systematic review summarized the landscape well. Novel findings in trained subjects suggest a possible advantage for longer rests. They even mention a study that found after trained individuals performed the leg extension and leg press with reps to failure, muscle protein synthesis was overall better when resting for 5 minutes between sets compared to 1 minute. This was despite the fact temporary increases in testosterone were larger with a 1-minute condition. At this present moment, we now have evidence to believe temporary increases in anabolic hormones likely play virtually no role in muscle hypertrophy. The scientific literature essentially remained here. No longer did it seem justified to say short rests are undeniably superior for muscle growth. Rather, if anything, we're seeing better gains with longer rests. I guess you could say the supremacy of short rests was short-lived, and it didn't take long for long rests to be speculated as better. Anyhow, you would have noticed in all the studies mentioned so far, we just compared 2 different rest times. But what about comparing multiple different rest times? Of course, a single study could do this, but we don't have that, at least not yet. Regardless, this is where the new meta-analysis comes into play. The researchers used an approach that enabled the comparison between multiple different rest times. The researchers combined the results of multiple studies, including much of the papers we mentioned, plus some others we've not yet fully touched on. Firstly, when simply comparing shorter rest, defined as 60 seconds or less between sets, to longer rest, defined as more than 60 seconds between sets, muscle hypertrophy tended to be better with a longer rest for both the arms and thighs. When the researchers divided rest time into 4 categories, we can actually see the intermediate rest time tended to see the greatest effect. So does that mean intermediate rest times are unquestionably long enough? It does not. The 95% credible interval was widest for this rest time. 95% credible intervals tell us there's a 95% probability that the true effect lies within the interval, given the observed data. Also, the credible intervals of all rest times show substantial overlap. And importantly, the results of a network meta-analysis conducted by the researchers simply revealed uncertainty about the benefits of resting more than intermediate durations. So what can we even infer from this data? Viewing these results from a different angle, we can visually see all rest times led to pretty great hypertrophy. This underscores how rest time is definitely not the most important factor for building muscle, something we shouldn't forget. Yet, we still see better gains with longer versus shorter rests. But as for how long is long enough, the analysis emphasizes the possibility somewhere around 90 seconds could be enough. But don't make the error thinking this is a strong conclusion. Further pointing to this, the studies behind this meta-analysis were quite different. They included the 2009 paper and the 2016 one, but they also included the 2010 and 2011 papers that compared 2 minutes of rest to another group that reduced their rest time down to 30 seconds. In the analysis, this latter group was considered to rest 80 seconds between sets, the average time they rested. But you could say resting 80 seconds between sets every session is very different to decreasing rest times across the weeks. The 2014 one conducted on older men that was confounded by the groups likely training at different proximities from failure was involved. And finally, this 2007 study conducted on untrained women comparing 20 to 80 seconds of rest was also included. Considering all this, although the nature of the analysis enabled us to make comparisons between different rest times, it's still true we want more quality studies that compare all the combinations. You may still want to consider that the most relevant and well-designed paper found in trained people, resting 3 minutes produced larger gains than 1 minute. So what should you do? When we consider more pieces of the puzzle, I feel there are some solid suggestions we can make. Based on all the evidence currently available on Earth, we can generally say that longer rests tend to be better than shorter rests, but it's difficult to truly say how long is enough. But knowing full well that rest time isn't the most critical factor, you could just rest however long you feel you need, and many people do this with great success. This may lead you to resting longer with compound exercises, but shorter with isolation exercises. The research isn't developed enough for us to know if the ideal rest time truly differs between compound and isolation exercises. We know the 2009 paper finding 2.5 minutes was better than 1 minute used a solid combination of both compound and isolation exercises, whereas the 2016 one finding 3 minutes was better than a minute predominantly used compound exercises. But a 2017 paper we've not mentioned yet, and also wasn't involved in the newest meta-analysis, had subjects predominantly train with arm isolation exercises, and fascinatingly found 30 seconds of rest between sets tended to produce greater arm growth than 3 minutes of rest between sets. Although, the group resting 30 seconds did use a lighter load while the group resting 3 minutes used a heavier load. This is actually why this study wasn't included in the new meta-analysis. But we've seen many times at the House of Hypertrophy that provided you're training to or close to failure, reps between 6 and 35 can produce similar hypertrophy, so perhaps it's not truly a confounder. Either way, I would still like to see this study replicated before we confidently assert anything. Regardless, this is the recommendation that may be most practical for most. If longer rests between sets are a problem as you can't work out for that long, using something called antagonistic supersets can help you save time while still technically resting longer between sets. We've dissected this in an older video at the House of Hypertrophy. Considering the conflicting information across the web, things can get pretty confusing about how you may want to train. I hope the videos at the House of Hypertrophy go some way to clearing up this confusion, but our high-quality partner, the Alpha Progression app, may also assist you. An extremely well-designed plan generator can help you generate an evidence-based muscle-building program 100% tailored to your needs. This can take you less than the time you take to brush your teeth. There are over a quadrillion input combinations on which your plan is based, and you can still personalize things. During workouts, the app analyzes your performance and suggests how you may progress to sustain muscle gains. Graphs display your long-term progress, and there's a huge exercise database of some of the best muscle building movements, with simple video and text instructions. Try out all the premium features free for 2 weeks with a link in the description and comments, and if you like it and choose to go beyond, the link gives you 20% off a subscription. Let's say you wanted to train with shorter rests, but still want to get as much growth as humanly possible. I think there are 2 things you may find interesting. Firstly, performing more sets with shorter rests could be highly effective. This 2020 paper demonstrates this. They found in untrained subjects performing the leg press for 3 sets per session, resting for 3 minutes between sets produced greater quad gains than resting for 1 minute, but performing 4 to 5 sets per session with 1 minute of rest managed to produce similar gains to the 3 sets with 3 minutes of rest. Secondly, remember that pretty much every study we've seen lasted 8 to 12 weeks, but maybe you just adapt to shorter rests over the long term, so perhaps extra sets aren't necessarily even needed. Let me briefly detail 3 areas that potentially indirectly allude to this. In the aforementioned 1987 paper, bodybuilders commonly rested 10 to 90 seconds between sets, while powerlifters rested longer. When the researchers got all the subjects to train with a workout just involving 10 seconds of rest between sets, the bodybuilders were better able to maintain intensity across the sets than the powerlifters, potentially due to various endurance adaptations that made them more fatigue resistant. Recall the 2010 and 2011 papers found that gradually decreasing rest time across weeks was able to produce similar hypertrophy to resting 2 minutes between sets. So perhaps this also points to how gradually decreasing rest time enables your body to accustom itself to shorter rests. Finally, this 2021 study caught my eye. Trained subjects trained their lower body 3 times per week. A normal group trains with sets of 8 reps with 2 minutes of rest between sets, but a blood flow restriction group used blood flow restriction bands and trained with lighter loads, higher reps, and just rested 45 seconds between sets. After 9 weeks of training, quad growth, as well as slow and fast twitch fiber growth, was similar between both groups. In other words, this study technically found that a program involving 45 seconds of rest between sets was able to produce similar gains to another involving 2 minutes of rest between sets in trained subjects. Although very much speculative and possibly wrong, perhaps the blood flow restriction further promoted various endurance-like adaptations that contributed to the body becoming accustomed to shorter rests. If you're someone who's currently using longer rest, but wants to experiment with transitioning to shorter rest, and you're not a fan of performing extra sets, the pinned comment details how I recommend you do this. If none of this interests you, rest assured that taking longer rests between sets is perfectly fine. After all, we've seen multiple studies demonstrating this, and this notion of you adapting to shorter rests is currently very much hypothetical. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. Here's the summary points. Feel free to check out the Alpha Progression app or our recent deep dive into building the triceps.